Good morning, my friends. This is Paul. This has been a terrible day for filming. I have now failed at the last 2 attempts at filming something else. So I decided, you know what? I'm an ISTJ. We do the best when we stick to what we know. And for me, that's Myers-Briggs. I was told by my friend Danielle, an ENFP, that I'm like an expert at Myers-Briggs. I wouldn't go that far, but compared to what most of my other friends know, that's a pretty fair assumption if you go by that small circle alone. So I wanted to talk about the 4 Myers-Briggs types that are 1 letter away from mine and see exactly how different are they despite only having 1 letter that's different. And so for those of you that aren't doing the mental math quickly enough, those would be the ESTJ, the INTJ, the ISFJ, and the ISTP. And if you still haven't figured out, that means that I am an ISTJ. And I used to mistype as an ESTJ, which explains the exuberant hand motions, or maybe it's because I have like 2% Italian in me. I don't know. Not much, but I have done stage before, so maybe that's why. So I want to talk about the ESTJ first, because that was the one that I was typecast as for the longest time. When I first took the test, not really knowing like how to take the test, I got ESTJ, and I just was like, okay, whatever. Read the description. I thought it sounded a lot like me. You know, the rigorous rule keepers, the ones that tell people what to do, the ones that are like, if you disagree with me, then there's something wrong with you because I only want what's right for you. I was like, that sounds so much like me. Then I looked deeper into the function stack, and I looked deeper into the difference between an extroverted judging type and an introverted judging. Well, technically I'm an introverted perceiving type. It's weird with the introverted types. And man, is there a difference. Although at first glance, if you're observing an ISTJ and an ESTJ together, you might not necessarily be able to tell the difference right away. You see, our functions are ever so slightly changed. Like the sensing and thinking is one off. So they have dominant thinking, we have dominant sensing. And then they have inferior feeling, we have inferior intuition. So not too much difference at first glance. So same functions, just in an ever so slightly different order. However, that dominant function for the ESTJ makes all the difference in the world, dearie. You see, when you have a dominant judging function, which is thinking and feeling, the perceiving functions are sensing and intuition. That's why the introverts are messed up, because I may be an ISTJ, but my dominant function is a perceiving one, so I really should be an ISTP. And because EJs are known for being dominant cholerics, they tend to go through life feeling like they have the system totally figured out. That not necessarily because they learned it, not necessarily because they studied so much, but just because that's the way it is. They don't tend to question things a whole lot, like traditions, for example. If you take an ESTJ to a Thanksgiving dinner, they're going to cook it the way that most Americans cook a Thanksgiving dinner, with turkey and mashed potatoes and sweet potatoes. They're not going to question it. They're going to say, that's how it always is, just deal with it. And they tend to make judgments really harshly before they think about all the facts. So they might like say, what are you doing slacking off, you bunch of idiots? Before the one like shy introvert raises their hand and says, the dishwasher broke. Oh. Of course they won't apologize for that outburst. No. They have to be like, well, whatever, get back to work once it's fixed. And ISTJs are sort of like that, but ever so slightly softer. ISTJs are likely going to be like, okay, why is there a mess here? Can someone explain to me what happened? To explain why there's a huge pile of dishes. I think I feel safe saying that I used to work as a dishwasher now that I quit the job. So, because their dominant function is sensing, they're going to be thinking about it. They're going to say, okay, let's observe what is going on around us. We may not have extroverted sensing, but we still have sensing. We're going to look into what's going on around us. And so, as a result, ISTJs tend to be ever so slightly more on the pensive side. I've been told that I have such a deep thinking face, usually it's when I go like that my sister says she can see the cogs turning in my head. I've said that before. I'm saying it again. It's my channel. Also, ISTJs are capable of being bossy. I should know, I'm one of them. I've chaperoned so much that I can kind of act like an ESTJ when doing stuff like head counts and saying like, girls, how many times have I told you to put away that phone? But the main difference is that ESTJs are going to look for order, whereas ISTJs are going to look for the rules. I mean, ESTJs do rules too, but they'll break the rules if they see that order is more important. So an ESTJ might rush through a task and say like, rules are just a guideline in this case. ISTJs hardly ever do that, if ever. Usually, if the schedule for a conference says be there at 7 o'clock, the ISTJ is going to be angry at the teenagers if they arrive at 7:01. It's a little bit ridiculous. We really need to develop our spontaneous side. Also, ISTJs are ever so slightly more willing to bend than an ESTJ. ESTJs, because their dominant function is a judging one, and that means this external logical system has to be maintained at all times, they will freak out if that is not upheld. Like, for them it's logic or nothing. For ISTJs, we do value logic a lot. And a lot of times my friends have told me I'm a little bit too logical because I'll be logic-ing, like, why is it that they were attractive to a certain guy? I'd say, like, okay, what chemicals in the brain caused this? Have you thought through the ramifications of what would happen if you dated this guy? And they're just like, oh, stop overthinking it. ISTJs never overthink or underthink. They only think exactly how much they need to, unless they're under stress. I said that in the last episode, so I won't go further. ISTJs are more likely to get perturbed if people aren't thinking practically. See, ISTJs have this incredible encyclopedic memory of facts that they've obtained. They like to talk about what is real, what is tangible, and what is now. They sometimes get caught in the past. By sometimes, I mean like nearly every other day. But most of the time when they're in a crowd, they're going to have to use their extroverted thinking a lot more than usual. However, the way they present that extroverted thinking is going to be based on what are the practical things we can do first. So they're going to first analyze the situation and say, well, as much as I'd like to use logic here, we don't have the means of doing it. Whereas ESTJs are just going to be like, just do it already! And we might be like, well, we can't just do it. That's just not possible. And as logical as ESTJs claim to be, sometimes they'll blatantly ignore laws of science. Like, they might forget that crying is healthy, but instead they'll say that crying is a weakness. And it's like, why do you claim to be so logical if you can't understand the fundamental need for tears? I mean, heck, you guys throw hissy fits when you get angry. So who are you to be hypocrites and be judging people for crying for stubbing their toes when you'll like flip over furniture and scream at the top of your lungs if people don't do what they say at work? You know, it's like, if you're gonna point fingers at someone, point fingers at yourself too. Also, ESTJs are not as likely to be so critical of themselves. They're likely to be a lot more confident. Because they have that dominant extroverted thinking, followed by tertiary extroverted intuition, they tend to have a drive to move forward. ISTJs question that drive. They say, well, maybe I don't want to be ambitious. Maybe I'm okay with just staying the same as I am. That can sometimes drive ESTJs crazy, because they might say, you have so much talent, why are you wasting it? And ISTJs are just like, I'm comfortable being where I am. And that's the inferior intuition saying, I don't need to innovate. I don't need to push forward. The tertiary feeling also means that we're going to be ever so slightly more attuned to what we're feeling on the inside, and that's ever so slightly going to make a difference on how we act. That introverted feeling is going to cushion us from just like flat out assaulting the person for their lack of common sense, but it's also going to determine our values. ESTJs often think that their feeling makes them weak. ISTJs, on the other hand, don't think feeling makes them weak. It's more so if they're afraid of if they reveal it to people, it's going to cause problems. So ISTJs prefer to selectively express their emotions, when deep down inside it's actually working quite a lot in the background, as far as like, I refuse to smoke marijuana, or I refuse to go out of my faith because I have found no evidence to suggest that my faith is foolproof, leading to a certain level of stubbornness. Overall, ISTJs and ESTJs are pretty similar, especially if you put them in chaperoning roles. Then it's really hard to tell them apart. But if you put them in a situation where they're trying to keep everyone under control, they will handle it very differently. Now for the INTJs. INTJs share the two middle functions of the ISTJ. They have secondary extroverted thinking and tertiary introverted feeling. So as far as how we judge, in the sense of like our ideas and our systems, we're going to be similar, but the way in which we perceive those systems is going to be totally opposite. INTJs lead with introverted intuition, so they're going to look for the deeper meaning in everything, and I'm not going to try to over-explain that function because that's my bottom of the bottom of my 8 functions, and that function just confounds me to no end, which makes interacting with INFJs a real pain. Although, credit where credit is due, me and Kara do pretty darn well for being basically enigmas to each other. And then their inferior function is extroverted sensing, which means they have an astonishingly scary lack of awareness. Driving in a car with an ISTJ is one of the most frightening experiences I've ever had, because they drive through stop signs. They get honked at because they don't seem to realize when they need to make their turn. They'll miss when the light turns green, and I'll have to say, yo, it's green. What are you doing sitting around here? They'll I don't know how they can consider themselves so genius and logical and yet miss out on something so obvious. But on the other hand, they will say to me, but Paul, you're so shallow and narrow-minded. Why don't you want to branch out and think deeper than surface level stuff? To which I say, well, would you want to get slammed over the head with a hammer? Well, no, that would hurt. Thinking deep hurts. I would rather avoid the pain if I were you, thank you very much. So I would say INTJs and I have an interesting relationship. My best friend is an INTJ. He and I have known each other for so many years, I'm starting to lose count. And while we get into disagreements, as far as like he'll want to try a new thing, I'll say, oh no, this is probably a disaster. Most of the time it is. Every now and then Andy's really shocked me. He's come up with something and he said, Paul, I think you'll really like it. And I do. And I guess that's him developing his sensing ever so slightly by, instead of just presenting the super random thing, he'll actually think about like, okay, he is a sensor. He's not going to like the same things I do. So I'm going to suggest something that I believe a sensor will get a lot of enjoyment out of. And I appreciate that. But when INTJs start talking about why aesthetics are pleasing and like the logic behind why when you put red on one side of the room it makes sense, I'm just totally lost. And his ESTP brother is even more lost than me. So, as long as INTJs mostly stick to talking about their beliefs and like how they how do they implement these observations into tangible worldly ways to get those ideas across, we're fine. We agree on like everything morally. Like if Andy says, Vatican II says this, I'll be like, absolutely. The problem is that we come to it with different methods. I'll come to it by past observation. He'll come to it by taking existing material, looking deeper into it and saying, aha, I found the message. Which occasionally I do that too, but like that's his entire life. Now on to the ISFJs. This is ever so slightly difficult to talk about because to my knowledge I only know 2 ISFJs in my life, one of which I hardly ever talk to. So from my experience, which is extremely limited, and my friend Danielle worded it really nicely. She said, you and ISFJs would be pal types, wouldn't you? And I'm like, Yeah, kinda. I mean, I could see us being pals. Pretty nice. ISFJs share the same dominant and bottom function as I do. They have dominant introverted sensing and inferior extroverted intuition. So we're going to have equal reluctance to trying new things and an equally strong share of learned facts. However, their middle functions are different. They have secondary extroverted feeling and tertiary introverted thinking. So that means they're going to lean ever so slightly closer to the mysteriousness of the INFJ, albeit they'll be better at explaining it because they're sensors. So whereas INFJs might try to make their already complicated minds more complicated, ISFJs might be able to use a reference from something in the past or something tangible to explain themselves. Not saying they're good at explaining themselves, they're actually still kind of pathetic because their tertiary introverted thinking means that expressing their logic is just as hard as an ISTJ expressing their feelings. ISFJs tend to not want to talk about their logical system because they figure it out as they go, as opposed to the ISTJ where they have this preconceived notion of what logic is based on, like, well, there's the law, and there's the police, and there's the Constitution. The ISFJs will say, let me figure this out in my own way, on my own terms. Their extroverted feeling makes them way more attuned to empathy and problems. ISFJs are not going to hesitate as much when, say, someone is crying or someone is feeling left out. They're the ones that are going to say, come join us, and they're likely to have a much softer voice. Granted, they're IJs, just like me, so of course the non-IJ types are going to say, especially the ones that are not SJs. They're going to say, oh my gosh, SJs are so rigid. And ISFJs do not like to go outside routine, just like me. So we get along in that respect. We also get along in the respect that, like, intuitives just melt our brains with, like, how deep they get into things. The only thing I would say is, like, a major point of contention between me and ISFJs, and this is a huge stretch, actually, is when they tell me off for being slightly insensitive, which I don't always try to be. It's more so that I don't recognize that there should be emotion in the moment. ISFJs will be like, now Paul, don't you think that's a bit rude? And I'll be like, hey, yeah, I guess you could say that. But ISFJs also don't really have a backbone most of the time. They're so afraid of hurting people's feelings because of their extroverted feeling that if they're doing something, if someone else is doing something wrong and they get blamed for it, they'll take the blame because they don't want to hurt the other person. Now, if they've developed their sensing and thinking enough, maybe they can overcome this. I don't know. If you're an ISFJ that's overcome this, let me know in the comment section. I want to hear it. But they're just not known for liking confrontation. Sure, they're pretty straightforward when they're talking about something that's not of a confrontational nature, but when it comes to, like, telling someone off, the ISFJ is going to run for the hills and say, like, I'll leave it to the ISTJ. They have no problem with that. But the ISFJ likes the ISTJ because we can put a rational spin on something that's sensible. So while we're both very practical, the ISFJ will think, what's the best way to tackle the person's feelings? And I'll say, what's the best way to tackle the solution? And it works really well if we're working together. Because, like, say we're planning an event together, the ISFJ will think of the rooming arrangements that are the most accommodating to the people based on their personal feelings. And the ISTJ will think of the most accommodating agenda that works the best. So, overall, pretty good work partners. I wouldn't mind working with an ISFJ. Finally, we get into the ISTPs. And this is both really hard and really easy at the same time, because ISTPs and ISTJs, despite sharing 3 out of 4 letters, have 0, I repeat 0, functions in common in their top 4. ISTPs have introverted thinking, extroverted sensing, introverted intuition, and extroverted extroverted feeling, which my friend Joe claims he doesn't have intuition at all. So, I don't know what to think about that. And then ISTJs have introverted sensing, extroverted thinking, introverted feeling, extroverted intuition. So, we may both be thinking types, and we may both be sensing types, and we may both be introverted types, but the way that we perceive the world is going to be totally different. ISTPs are likely going to learn as they go along. They don't usually like people to tell them ahead of time what to expect or how to do things. They don't have the introverted sensing to store it. Instead, they're going to learn in the here and now. Maybe not as much as the ESTPs, but ISTPs are usually really good with like futzing around with their hands or with their senses and saying like, I smell something burning. I think I know what's going on. Or they could like look at some wires and say, let's experiment a bit with this and see where we can go. ISTJs don't like doing that. ISTJs like going by protocol. And so the ISTP is much more likely to be able to experiment to figure out the answer. On the other hand, if they don't know what they're doing, they might need someone to pull them aside and say, let's consult an expert, because you don't know everything. Because sometimes ISTPs can come across as though they do know everything because they have dominant introverted thinking, and so they have this system that they believe is like this foolproof logical system, even though it's actually based mostly on their own experience. They don't tend to have an objective form of logic. They tend to just make an observation, but the observation is more subjective in the moment. So, for example, they might say, Paul, it's really not that big of a deal if I go 60 instead of 50 on the freeway because I need to keep at the flow of traffic and I don't want to get hit. And it's like, I guess situationally that's a logical thing to do, but it's not universally logical. That's not what it says in the rule books. And that's where we differ hugely. Also, with them having inferior extroverted feeling, they're not going to get as emotional as us ISTJs. But they are going to be more aware, ever so slightly. It may be their bottom function, but it still exists. Ever so slightly, they're going to be more aware of how their actions affect the other person. But because it's inferior, they're not going to care. Instead, ISTPs sometimes use that inferior extroverted feeling as a way of getting under people's skin. They might use it as a way of like teasing the people that they love, or they might do it just because they don't really care what other people feel or think, and so they might just say what's on their mind and like insult a person and say like, well, if you're upset by this, just tough it out. Like, why are you blaming me for your over-emotionalism? Also, their introverted intuition means they're ever so slightly better at detecting the hidden meaning, although they usually don't like doing that. For me, I have found that ISTPs use their intuition the best when I'm thinking about something way too literally, being a dominant sensor. And the ISTP can see the underlying meaning behind what the person is trying to say. And they might say, well, Paul, this is what they actually meant. But because it's tertiary intuition, they're not going to want to think deep about everything. They're like going to be bored out of their minds with, small groups and discussions. Oftentimes, ISTPs don't like talking at all in a group setting because they feel like their logic is up here, and so they don't need to verbalize what their beliefs are, because their beliefs are like the kind that they feel like, I believe it. I don't need to tell you it. Just trust me on this. Which is totally countercultural to how I work. Because I'm doing all these YouTube videos, and I'm just like, yeah, I want to talk about what I believe in. I want to talk about what I'm thinking. I want to talk about what's on my mind. ISTPs, they don't see the need for that. They'll be like, okay, if I meet a cool person, I'll talk about what I like, but I don't see the need to broadcast it. Also, from my experience, they're generally ever so slightly more reserved than we ISTJs are, except at parties. ISTPs seem to really love parties. They may not be the center of attention at the party. they may not necessarily be talking to everyone there, but there's something about being in that environment that stimulates their extroverted sensing. So they may be pretty good at dancing, but they're not gonna like make the spotlight on them. ISTPs generally like to stay away from the spotlight and be in the background. So you'll often see ISTPs like helping out people. That's their inferior extroverted feeling slowly creeping in. But they won't like to be thanked for it, and they won't like their attention noticed. Like, they'll usually sneak in. Like, for my young adult group, my friend Joe, he usually likes to clean the place up. But he hardly ever likes to do it when people are watching. He doesn't mind me because I usually just take a nap. But most of the time, he goes in when no one else is there and like works for like 3 hours without anyone noticing. And then if people say like, "Great job, Joe," he'll just be like, "Whatever, no problem." Not to say that ISTPs are rude all the time. I mean, most of the ISTPs I know are actually quite polite. Not like gentlemanly polite like an ISTJ, but polite enough where they'll be like, "Hey buddy, how's it going? Cool. That's nice. Doing okay? Yeah." So ISTPs are ever so slightly going to be a little bit more concerned about like the general public's consensus. Like, for example, ISTJs might just blurt out like, "Oh, that's such an Asian thing to do," and the ISTP might be like, "Wow, Paul, why are you being so racist?" And I'd be like, "Why is that a big deal?" Because I don't have extroverted thinking, I have introverted thinking. I'm just stating the facts. They're like, "Well, don't state the facts if that could be potentially offensive," even though they tend to be offensive themselves. So I should look at that link Danielle sent me a long time ago called "How Every Myers-Briggs Type Contradicts Themselves." Anyway, those are brief thoughts. I've done videos on all 4 of those types separately, so you can watch those if you want most of this repeated, but a couple of other things to add in there. So I hope you enjoyed this. If there are any questions, please let me know, and until the next time, keep the faith, stay epic, God bless, and whatever type you are, just try your best to do the message of Jesus, or if you're not a Jesus follower, do the message of morality and common sense, and who knows, maybe there will be an ENTJ saint one day. Bye-bye.